Bit of background. I first became interested in the War of 1812, nearly 50 years ago when I was a teaching fellow at the University of Toronto and encountered things like the Brock Monument down in Niagara and Fort York in Toronto itself. But here I'm going to concentrate on the frigate actions, and these have particular relevance to Unicorn, as it will see as we go through. So to begin with, what about the background? Well, at sea, the Royal Navy had a manpower shortage, and as part of redressing this, it said it claimed the right to impress any British nationals, which it defined as anyone born in Britain, on a ship of any other country. And it didn't recognise that other countries could assign citizenship. In the US, however, they believed that the British deserters, and who there were quite a lot, could become American citizens. But they failed to provide documentation for this in many cases, so that the individuals on board the ships had no documentation to say that they'd become American citizens. So that around 1805, it was estimated that there were something like 11,000 naturalized British sailors serving on US ships. And the US Secretary of the Treasury estimated that 9,000 US sailors have been born in Great Britain or Ireland. So we're not talking about small numbers, we're talking about very large numbers of individuals. Because of the Napoleonic Wars in 1807, Britain restricted neutrals trading with France. And this was one of America's biggest customers. So that meant there was additional pressure on the Madison government to do something about it. So, but also, Britain was America's main trading partner. It took something like 80% of the cotton and 50% of other exports. So we have this conflict. The British wanted to stop trading with France. America wanted to trade with France, but they also wanted to trade with Britain. There were a number of incidents at sea where British ships boarded and took what it considered British sailors off those American ships. So everything was set up for the war that subsequently developed. On land, the Americans were trying to expand to the northwest by the Great Lakes. This was opposed by the Indian nations, and those Indian nations were supported and supplied by the British, either by water through the Great Lakes or on land. And in 1982, Monroe stated that it might be necessary to invade Canada to bring the situation to a satisfactory conclusion, whatever that was. And as an aside, the War of 1812, to me, is a unique feature. It's the only war I'm aware of where all participants claim they won. The British, the Canadians, the Indians, and the Americans all claim victory in the war. And Madison believed that the British policies at sea were harming the Americans, but that Canada was profiting from smuggling. So that's the background. Just to give you an idea in terms of the area, that's the main area on land, and the harbors, Boston, New York, down to Baltimore, were the main American bases. York is now Toronto, but at the time was the capital, and that was the area under dispute. So we're going to concentrate now on the frigate actions. So to begin, the American Navy, it had about 16 warships and around 7,000 sailors at the beginning of the war. But key to this were what are known as the 6 frigates. And these were authorized, something like nearly 20 years earlier, and they're designed by Joshua Humphreys. And they were quite a unique construction. They were much bigger than their rating suggested. They were very strong, and Humphreys introduced this diagonal bracing, which strengthened. This wasn't iron, This was wood bracing, but they were very strong ships and they were very large. At the time, the Royal Navy standard frigate was a 38-gun frigate. The Unicorn is a perfect example of this. But these carried 44 guns and were much heavier constructed. In fact, they were rated at 44 guns. They carried a much heavier armament. As you'll see, they carried 32 24-pounders. Unicorn carries 18-pounders. But they also had a heavy carronade armament, so they're carrying over 50 guns. But the important thing is that they had both long guns, the 24-pounders, and the close-range carronades. Those were the three big frigates, the Constitution, the President, and the United States. And then they had three more conventional frigates, the Chesapeake, the Congress, and the Constellation. But again, with this mixed armament. If you compare the armament of, say, the Chesapeake with the Unicorn, it is a much heavier armament, particularly in terms of carronades. So these ships were the backbone of the US Navy at the start of the war. The Royal Navy was preoccupied with Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. So the squadrons based in Halifax were based around frigates, much lighter than the Americans. So the British, once they saw the American frigates, they realized that their 38-gun frigates couldn't engage the big American frigates on anything like equal terms. So they took a suggestion of this gentleman, Captain John Hayes, otherwise known as John Magnificent Hayes, that they raze some 74s, cut the top deck off and make them into 50-gun heavy frigates while keeping the scantlings and the rigging of the sail of the line. So they did this with three ships, Goliath, Majestic, and Saturn, and Hayes was given command of the Majestic and ultimately ended up as Commodore blockading New York. So they also built two frigates along the lines of the American frigates, the Newcastle and the Leander, but they built them very rapidly using pitch pine, which enabled them to speed up construction. And they took the Endymion as a model, which was the only big frigate they had, excluding razes like the Indefatigable, and built another 5 of those. The Endymion will feature in our story later. It was based on the French prize, the Pomone, and was noted as being a particular fast sailor. So that's a bit of background about the ships. So, 1812. And we've got the first of the frigate actions, the Guerriere, was burnt by the Constitution. Famous first, the year of 1812 saw the three most famous actions, possibly of the war. The first, the Guerriere, was burnt by the USS Constitution. The Guerriere was actually a French frigate. It had been captured in 1806 and taken into Royal Navy service. And it's during this action that a cannonball bounced off the sides of the Constitution, and somebody claimed her sides are made of iron, which gave her the nickname of the Old Ironsides. And when asked if he was surrendering, Captain Dacres commented, "Well, sir, I don't know. Our mizzenmast is gone, our fore and mainmasts are gone. I think on the whole you may say we have struck our flag." But they were outgunned. They're up against a heavier ship. They were up against a ship with long guns and short-range guns. So it wasn't a foregone conclusion, but purely looking at the ships, it was an inevitable result. But it was not what the Royal Navy had come to expect. They believed that in a single ship action, they would win. So these three actions of 1812 came as something of a shock to the Royal Navy. So they'd assumed at this point that they would win any single ship actions. And of the ships of this era, the Constitution is still around. It's in Boston Harbor, and every so often it's taken for a sail around Boston Harbor. Very interesting to visit. A little later, we have the Macedonian against another of the big frigates, the United States, with a similar result. The Macedonian was a recently built frigate, lively class, standard built, but again, it was overwhelmed by the firepower of the United States. And the United States 12, Macedonian 100. And another interesting aside, that Captain Carden of the Macedonian had lunch with Decatur and bet him a beaver cap on the. So he had to pay up a beaver to Decatur with a beaver cap because he lost the bet. But again, his ship was outmatched by the United States. And the third action is the Java against the Constitution, which took place in the South Atlantic rather than the North Atlantic. And again, the result, as we now see, inevitable result, was the same. The Java was another French prize, the Renommée, taken into Royal Navy service. Had suffered severe casualties again. It was outgunned and outmassed, essentially. So it lost 22 killed and 102 wounded to 9 and 57. So these three actions resulted in the building of the Newcastle, the land of the Razes and so on. Then the British instituted a blockade. They got sail of the line 74s, which couldn't catch the frigate, but they got other ships like the Razes, and working from Halifax, they instituted a close blockade of the American ports. And that effectively stopped the American frigates coming out. Then in June 1813, we have probably the most famous of all the actions. The Chesapeake was taken by HMS Shannon, and that took place off Boston. Now, Shannon was commanded by Captain Brooke, who was, for the era, somewhat unusual. He studied the science of gunnery, and he introduced several innovations. He brought in improved sights. He had put bearing markers onto the deck so the gunners could fire essentially blind. They could just told what angle to point it at. And important in the context of the action, he had a pair of 9-pounders mounted on swivels as dismantling guns, whose prime role was to wreck the opposing ship's ability to steer. It's also a sister ship of the Unicorn. The Shannon is a Lader-class frigate, as is the Unicorn. So the underwater hull of the Shannon and the Unicorn are the same. The above the waterline Unicorn is different, and it's also different internally below the waterline because of the introduction of and use of wrought iron by Seppings. But it is a sister ship of the Unicorn. So Chesapeake was commanded by Commander James Lawrence, who just recently taken command, and Brooke was smarting from the fact that the president had escaped his blockade of Boston and the fog, so he challenged Lawrence to a single ship duel. He wrote him a letter, sent it into harbour. Lawrence never received it because he'd already decided to sail. And he was of the same mind. He was going to fight a single ship duel. They were very evenly matched in terms of guns. Chesapeake had a slightly larger complement. And the engagement began at about 1800 on the afternoon at about 35 meters range. Basically, Shannon waited. Shannon in red waited for the Chesapeake in blue to approach. And of course, under those circumstances, particularly with Brooke's gunnery training, he was able to inflict significant damage onto the forward guns on the Chesapeake. They then sailed more or less parallel. Chesapeake was able to bring a carronades into play, damaging Shannon's rigging, but Shannon's gunnery was still as an advantage. At this point, Chesapeake began to overhaul Shannon. It was sailing, Shannon was waiting, therefore it had more momentum, it carried it past it. Lawrence tried by manipulating sails to slow the Chesapeake down, And at this point, the dismantling 9-pounder wrecked on Shannon, wrecked Chesapeake's wheel. So Chesapeake became unmanageable. It also killed and wounded most of the officers on the Chesapeake's quarterdeck, including Lawrence. So they went past each other, and then Chesapeake drifted back towards Shannon out of control. Now, this, because of the relative velocity's relative momentum, it actually drifted on to Shannon, and it became entangled in the anchor. And then this gentleman, Mr. Stevens, who was the bosun on the Shannon, actually lashed them together. And from that point, it moves to a boarding action. And by this time, there were no officers left on the upper deck of the Chesapeake. Brooke led the boarders, and in the main image, you'll see he's wearing an officer's hat. In fact, he went on wearing a top hat. So that's what he was actually wearing when he went into led the boarding parties onto the Chesapeake. The Americans tried to counterattack Lieutenant Ludlow, but was killed. The rigging, there was battle going on the deck, and there was a battle going on in the masts, and Midshipman William Smith charged across the yards onto the Chesapeake. And at this point, they began to drift apart. The American resistance by this time was almost over. Brooke himself was wounded in the final attack on the forecastle, and the Shannon now had control of the upper deck, but the Americans then fired through the hatchway from below, and the First Lieutenant, Lieutenant Falconer, then threatened to blow the brains out of the next person to fire, which ended all resistance. At that point, the engagement had taken just 10 minutes, and Chesapeake had a prize crew put on board and was taken to Halifax as a prize. Shannon had 23 men killed, and Chesapeake had around 48 killed and 99 wounded. The figures are not exact. Afterwards, Brooke was made a baronet, awarded the Freedom of the City of London, and a 100-guinea sword. So 100-guinea sword, 50-guinea swords were awarded as standard for captains who'd done a valorous deed. But his head wound, which had in fact exposed part of his brain, meant he never commanded another ship. Lawrence was buried in Halifax, and you can visit his grave if you go there. Shannon served in the Royal Navy until 1831 and was broken up in 1859. Having had the success the previous year, the Americans felt humiliated by the loss of the Chesapeake. But unlike the previous actions, Chesapeake had come up against what Peter Padfield says is a more destructive vessel of her force had probably never existed in the history of naval warfare. Brooke's training was such that this was probably, as Padfield says, the most effective fighting ship serving anywhere at that time. Anyway, to continue. I know this is strictly not a frigate action, but it's important in the context because while the war at sea was continuing, the war at the Great Lakes was developing. And in fact, by the end of the War of 1812, you had sail of the line operating on the Great Lakes. The most famous action being the Battle of Lake Erie, and that took place between a British squadron under Barclay and the Americans under Oliver Hazard Perry. The American ships were much more heavily armed, particularly in terms of carronade. In fact, they had about 3-to-1 in weight of shot in terms of carronades, as opposed to British having slight advantage in cannon. The US flagship, the Lawrence, took the brunt of the early casualties, and Perry was forced to transfer to another ship, the Niagara, and he was reportedly accompanied in this and protected in this by his personal servant, an African-American called Cyrus Tiffany. The British flagship, the Detroit, then collided with another of the British ships, which effectively took them out of the battle, enabled Niagara to break the British line and to rake them with the heavier carronade armament. That forced the British ships to surrender. I think it's the only action recorded where the whole of a British squadron has been taken as prize by the enemy. Anyway, to revert back to sea and moving on to 1814. We move now to the west coast of South America, and the USA Essex and Essex Junior against Phoebe and Cherub. The Essex, commanded by David Porter, had entered the Pacific in 1813, and it operated around the Galapagos, and it captured 13 whalers. One of those, the Atlantic, which was originally a French prize, was converted into an armed tender and named the Essex Junior. Eventually, after refitting, Porter sailed for Valparaiso and was trapped there by the Phoebe and the Cherub. There was a period of about 6 weeks in which both sides tried in various ways to force an engagement. Porter eventually managed to escape, but lost a foretopmast, foretopmast in heavy weather when exiting the bay. But now, unlike the earlier actions of 1812, the roles are in a sense reversed, because the Phoebe had long guns, whereas the Essex was carronade armed. That meant that the Phoebe could stand off at long range and fight the Essex, with the Essex unable to close the range to engage, and Cherub significantly outmatched the Essex Junior. So that was a role reversal. The armament on the Phoebe enabled her to fight as the Americans had done earlier, and Essex eventually surrendered. Minor casualties on the Phoebe and the Cherub. An interesting fact is that on the Essex was somebody called James Glasgow Farragut, who was Porter's adopted son, and who you'll probably know as the leading Union admiral during the American Civil War. So we come now to 1815, and the president is captured by the Endymion. The president was in New York, and there was a storm, a blizzard, in fact, which drove off the blockading ships under Commodore John Hayes. So the president was unable to escape, but she grounded on a shoal, and she stuck there. Interestingly, the president was the one of the 3 big frigates that did not have the strengthening of the hull in the diagonal riders. For some reason, she had a more normal hull, inner hull construction. The Rasay Majestic initially gained, but then the chase was taken up by the Endymion, which was the fastest sailor in the squadron, possibly in the Navy, it was reputed to be. And eventually it was able to position itself on President's starboard quarter, where none of the President's stern chaser could bear. If you go upon Unicorn, you will note that would not be the case, because the Unicorn has the round stern that Seppings developed, which meant there were no blind spots for the stern chasers, whereas the President had the square stern, and there were blind spots on both quarters, and the Endymion took up a position in those blind spots where it could fire on the President, but the President couldn't fire back. So an interesting design change that Seppings introduced would have mitigated that problem. Eventually, the Endymion positioned herself to rake the President and wounded Decatur. And then Hope, the captain, who had learnt from Brooke, began to target the President's guns. And at around 8 o'clock, the President ceased fire, hoisted a lamp to indicate surrender. At the time, President had 6 feet of water in the hold and 6 of her starboard guns dismounted. However, all Endymion's boats were damaged. So she had no means of sending anybody on board President to take a formal surrender. Now, this next bit has been argued about for years, whether Decatur was cheating. Endymion ceased fire and hove to for repairs, waiting for the rest of the squadron, which would be the normal practice of the time. As far as they were concerned, President had surrendered and wouldn't go anywhere. So Decatur said, "Oh, thank you very much. I will raise sail and attempt to sail off," thereby essentially technically breaking the rules, though that's the point that's been argued about ever since, whether he, however, that, judge as you may. But the damage, the water in the hole, slowed President, and she was eventually overtaken by the frigates Pomone and Tenedos. Again, like Shannon, both sisters of the Unicorn. At this point, Pomone fired a couple of broadsides, and Decatur then actually did strike this time, and the formal surrender was taken when Decatur requested his sword be given to what he referred to as the captain of the Black Ship, which was the Endymion, which had essentially outsailed and outfought him. And the casualties, as you will see, there's some debate about the number of casualties from the American sources and the British sources on board the President. And by now, of course, the war had ended. The war had ended by the time the President engagement took place, but nobody knew about it. And the final naval engagement took place on the 30th of June, when a ship, the USS Peacock, fired on the brig Nautilus off Java. The captain of the Nautilus told the commander of the Peacock that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed on December 1814. However, Peacock opened fire anyway. Take that as you may. If you want to look at, those are just some references. Padfield is the classic, along with Roosevelt's The War of 1812. Toll's book on 6 frigates tells you of the frigates, and then of course there's Mahan, 2 volumes of Mahan if you really want to do that. The MacLeod book is on the 4 wars, the Americans against the Canadians, the British, and etc. So there's plenty of reading if you want to follow that.